Imagine looking back at your life 10 years from now and realizing that the biggest thing holding you back was never a lack of money, talent, or opportunity. It was a few ideas you accepted as true without ever questioning them. Because of those ideas, you stayed in the wrong situations, avoided new opportunities, repeated the same mistakes, and convinced yourself that nothing could change. Most people never notice this. They simply call it personality, bad luck, or the way life is. In this audiobook, you will discover how hidden beliefs shape your decisions and how learning to question them. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new audiobooks. And now, let's begin. Introduction: The weight of what we believe. You probably didn't choose most of what you think. When you meet someone new, your brain makes rapid judgments about their trustworthiness, intelligence, social status before they finish their first sentence. When you scroll through news headlines, certain stories trigger immediate certainty while others feel instantly wrong. When someone challenges a view you hold, you might feel not just disagreement, but something closer to threat. These aren't random reactions. They're the product of beliefs accumulated over years, many of which you never consciously selected. Some came from your family, others from your culture, your education, your social media feed, or that one experience in 7th grade that you've unconsciously generalized into a rule about how the world works. I spent 15 years working as a psychologist before I fully grasped how much of human suffering stems not from external circumstances alone, but from the invisible beliefs we carry about those circumstances. I watched intelligent, capable people trapped by thoughts they'd never examined. I saw relationships destroyed by stereotypes so subtle that neither party could name them. I observed brilliant minds constrained by cognitive patterns formed decades earlier, in contexts that no longer existed. What struck me most was how invisible those beliefs were to the people holding them. The belief and the believer had merged so completely that there was no space between them, no vantage point from which to observe the belief as a belief rather than as a fact about the world. The cost of unexamined thinking. Sarah was a successful attorney who came to see me because of persistent anxiety. She couldn't understand it. On paper, her life was good, but she felt a constant pressure, a sense that she was never doing enough. After several sessions, we uncovered a belief she'd been operating from since childhood. If I'm not the best, I'm worthless. This belief had driven her success. It had also made success feel meaningless, because no achievement ever satisfied the underlying fear. Sarah's situation is common. We carry beliefs formed in childhood when we had limited information, absorbed from culture without examination, adopted as coping mechanisms and then overgeneralized. Whatever their content, unexamined beliefs constrain us. They narrow perception, limit choices, and amplify suffering beyond what circumstances require. The beliefs causing the most damage are often the ones that once served us well. Sarah's belief had pushed her through law school, through the bar exam, through the grueling early years of practice. Beliefs that have never worked are easy to discard. Beliefs that worked once and no longer do are the ones that trap us, because they carry the authority of past success. The promise of mental freedom. This book is built on a simple premise. You can learn to think more clearly. Not perfectly. Human cognition has inherent limitations, and certainty is usually an illusion. But you can develop the capacity to recognize your beliefs as beliefs rather than facts. You can learn to hold ideas more lightly. You can cultivate what Zen practitioners call beginner's mind, an openness to seeing things freshly, without the filter of assumptions. The benefits are practical. Better decisions, because you're responding to reality rather than your assumptions about it. Often less anxiety, because you're not defending beliefs as though your identity depends on them. Stronger relationships, because you can see people more clearly. Greater resilience, because you can adapt when circumstances change. To be clear, this freedom is not detachment from conviction. It is the capacity to hold your beliefs consciously, to know why you hold them, to recognize when they're doing your thinking for you, and to change them when the evidence demands it. What this book offers. The chapters build progressively. We start with the foundations of intellectual development. We then move through humility, unlearning, curiosity, the role of outside perspective, cognitive bias, flexibility, failure, and tunnel vision. Each builds on what came before. Humility makes unlearning possible. Unlearning makes curiosity productive. Curiosity makes external input worth seeking. The later chapters address the specific conditions under which thinking narrows most dangerously, when the stakes are real and the pressure is high. A note on the examples. The names and identifying details in every client story have been changed. Some are composites drawn from recurring patterns across multiple cases. The dynamics they illustrate are real. The individuals, as described, are not. A note on the journey. Examining your beliefs can be destabilizing. You might discover that ideas you've organized your life around don't hold up to scrutiny. You might face resistance from people who prefer you to think the way you've always thought. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with changing your mind about something important. The people around you may still hold the old view. Relationships built on shared assumptions feel strained when one person begins questioning them. The question is whether the cost of examining your beliefs is greater than the cost of never examining them, and in my experience, it rarely is. The goal is to hold beliefs consciously, to know what you believe, why you believe it, and what evidence might change your mind. In short, to think clearly so you can live freely. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Developing your intellectual abilities. Michael, a 42-year-old engineer, came to therapy with a complaint that surprised me. He felt bored. Not occasionally, chronically, deeply bored. His work had become routine. His conversations felt predictable. Even his hobbies felt mechanical. I feel like I'm just going through the motions, he said. Like my brain turned off 10 years ago and I've been running on autopilot ever since. A pattern emerged. Michael consumed the same media, had conversations about the same topics with the same people, approached problems using the same methods, and held the same opinions he'd formed in his 20s. Depression wasn't the obvious culprit. What stood out was that he had stopped growing intellectually. Many adults stop genuinely learning somewhere in their 30s or 40s, not from stupidity or laziness, but because the brain tends toward efficiency. Once it finds patterns that work, it defaults to them. This is useful until the world changes in ways our old patterns can't handle. The solution is not more information. It's developing intellectual capacity, the ability to think critically, question assumptions, integrate new ideas, and adapt. What intellectual development actually means. Intellectual development is about capacity, not accumulation. Knowledge is like raw materials. Intellectual ability is the skill to work with those materials, to build something, to reshape them, to recognize when they no longer serve their purpose. A person can accumulate enormous quantities of information and still think poorly if they lack the capacity to evaluate what they've collected, spot contradictions, and change course when evidence shifts. Conversely, someone with modest factual knowledge but strong intellectual capacity can navigate complex situations effectively, because they know how to think about what they encounter rather than simply reacting from stored conclusions. Research in cognitive psychology suggests that these abilities remain plastic throughout adulthood. What declines is not capacity, but our tendency to challenge ourselves. We settle into familiar patterns, surround ourselves with people who think like us, and treat our current understanding as final. This settling is actively reinforced. Every time you default to a familiar opinion without re-examining it, the pattern strengthens. Every time you avoid an uncomfortable idea, the boundary of your intellectual world contracts slightly. The contraction is imperceptible on any given day. Over years, it's profound. The hidden cost of stagnation. When intellectual abilities stagnate, you become less adaptable, navigating a changed world with outdated assumptions. Your decision-making suffers. You become more vulnerable to manipulation, because critical thinking is one of your best defenses against propaganda, bad faith arguments, and confident-sounding nonsense. Your relationships can become shallower, because genuine connection requires the ability to hold complexity without immediately defending your position. People who have stopped growing intellectually tend to flatten the people around them, reducing others to types, categories, predictable roles. The capacity to be surprised by another person depends on a mind still willing to revise. You lose touch with your own capacity for growth. You see yourself as fixed. I'm just not a math person. That's just how I am. Statements that feel like self-knowledge but function as self-limitation. 3 foundations. Developing intellectual abilities rests on 3 interconnected practices. Openness means approaching unfamiliar concepts without immediately judging them, creating enough mental space to genuinely consider something before deciding what you think. In practice, it requires tolerating a brief period of not uncertainty, of holding an idea without immediately categorizing it. The brain wants to sort and file. Openness means asking it to wait. Critical thinking is the ability to evaluate ideas rigorously, to examine evidence, identify logical flaws, distinguish correlation from causation, and question underlying assumptions. Without it, openness becomes naivety. Curiosity is the drive to discover what you don't yet know. Without it, you might develop the other 2 capacities but never use them. Openness and critical thinking are receptive. They help you deal with ideas that arrive. Curiosity goes looking for ideas worth dealing with. The practice of lifelong learning. Read widely, not just deeply. Read across disciplines. Read books that argue for positions you disagree with. The goal is not agreement, but the mental flexibility that comes from seeing how different fields approach problems. Engage with challenging material. When reading is effortless, you're usually confirming what you already know. When you have to reread sentences and pause to think through the argument, that's when you're actually learning. Write to think, not just to communicate. When you try to articulate an idea in writing, the gaps in your logic become visible. Writing forces a precision that thinking alone does not. Seek out dialogue with people who think differently. Ensure your beliefs are tested against the best counterarguments, not just the weakest ones. Untested ideas are fragile ideas, regardless of how confident you feel about them. Recognizing when you're stuck. Stagnation feels like stability. The feeling of being stuck is often indistinguishable from the feeling of being right. Signs: you haven't changed your mind about anything significant in years. You can predict exactly what your social group thinks about any issue. You feel threatened by opposing views. Your intellectual interests have narrowed. You rely on the same mental models you developed years ago. Recognizing stagnation requires the very capacities that stagnation erodes: honesty, openness, curiosity. These are circular requirements, which is why stagnation deepens over time rather than self-corrects. External disruption, a new challenge, a new relationship, a new field of study, is often what breaks the cycle. The path forward. Michael didn't transform overnight. He started reading one book per month outside his field. He joined a discussion group with people from different backgrounds. He began writing brief reflections on what he was learning. 6 months later, he reported feeling more alive intellectually than he had in years. Not because he'd accumulated more facts, but because he'd redeveloped the capacity to think freshly. He was, in his words, awake again. His mind was working again, not just running stored programs. Your beliefs will always exert a gravitational pull toward familiarity, but you don't have to surrender to that pull. There is, however, a foundation that makes all of this possible, one that many people overlook. Intellectual development depends on capacity, but capacity depends on a prior willingness, the willingness to not know. Chapter 2: Intellectual Humility. During a team meeting at a software company, a senior developer named Rachel was presenting a proposed solution to a technical problem. Midway through, a junior developer raised his hand. "I might be missing something," he said. "But wouldn't that approach create a bottleneck when we scale?" Rachel paused. She could feel the reflexive defensiveness that comes when someone questions your expertise, especially someone with less experience. Her first instinct was to defend her solution, to reassert her authority. Instead, she said, "I hadn't considered that. Walk me through your thinking." 10 minutes later, the team had identified a significant flaw in Rachel's proposal and developed a better solution together. What Rachel demonstrated was intellectual humility, the capacity to recognize the limits of your own knowledge and remain open to being wrong. What made her response remarkable was not that she agreed with the criticism. It was that she created space for it. In most interactions, the default is to defend. Someone pokes a hole in our argument. Our impulse is to patch the hole, not to examine whether the entire structure is sound. Rachel overrode that impulse, and it cost her something: a moment of visible uncertainty in front of colleagues. The cost was small. The return, a better solution and a team that now felt safe to speak up, was significant. What intellectual humility is. Intellectual humility is an epistemic stance, the accurate recognition that your knowledge has limits, your perspective is partial, your reasoning can be flawed, and other people might understand things you don't. This seems obvious in the abstract. In practice, we rarely operate from it. We speak with certainty about things we've barely studied. We dismiss contradicting perspectives without seriously considering them. Not from arrogance, usually, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Our culture reinforces this. We reward confidence, mock position changes, and criticize leaders who acknowledge gaps. The discomfort runs deeper than social pressure. The brain tends to treat open questions the way the body treats an open wound, as something that needs closing. Maintaining genuine intellectual humility, keeping questions open, resisting premature resolution, requires active effort against a natural cognitive tendency. You are not simply choosing to be humble. You are choosing to remain in a state your brain is designed to escape. Research by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger has documented a specific consequence. People with limited knowledge in a domain tend to overestimate their competence. They lack the knowledge to recognize what they're missing. Conversely, genuine experts tend toward greater awareness of complexity and uncertainty. The more you know, the more you recognize how much you don't know. The less you know, the more complete your understanding feels. Intellectual humility means calibrating confidence to actual understanding. Strong conviction where you have genuine grounds, provisional belief where you don't, and honest uncertainty where you haven't adequately investigated. The power of I don't know. 3 words, I don't know, might be among the most underused tools for intellectual development. When you pretend to know something you don't, you stop learning about it, make decisions on incomplete information, and spend cognitive energy maintaining the pretense. Admitting ignorance opens the door to discovery. In my clinical practice, the clients who made the most progress were often those who could say, I don't know why I keep doing this. As long as a person believes they already understand their own behavior, there is nothing to investigate. The feeling of understanding, even when false, shuts down the search. The same pattern holds elsewhere. Leaders who say, I don't know, what do you think, tend to get better input, because it signals that the leader values accuracy over performance. Partners who say, I don't understand your perspective, help me see it, build deeper connection, because the admission of not understanding is itself an act of respect. The ego trap. The most common obstacle to humility is ego, the part of you invested in being right, looking smart, and maintaining a consistent image of competence. When protecting your ego becomes more important than understanding reality, you're in trouble. A belief forms. It becomes part of how you see yourself. When contradicting information arrives, your ego treats it as threat. So you defend the belief, not because the evidence supports it, but because being wrong feels intolerable. You dismiss contrary data, you double down. This is especially pronounced in intelligent people. Intelligence gives better tools for defending beliefs, more sophisticated rationalizations, more convincing presentations. But intelligence, used to defend rather than test beliefs, is just a more elegant prison. The smartest people in the room are sometimes the most trapped, because their intelligence lets them construct airtight justifications for positions they arrived at for entirely non-rational reasons. The qualities that make you effective, intelligence, articulateness, the ability to construct persuasive arguments, are the same qualities that can most effectively prevent you from changing your mind. The better you are at thinking, the better you are at thinking your way around inconvenient evidence. The tools are neutral. They can be used for investigation or for defense, and defense is almost always more tempting because it protects something that feels essential, the story you tell about who you are. Openness to being wrong. Most people would rather be consistently wrong than admit they were wrong once. But research on learning and expertise consistently shows the people who develop the deepest understanding tend to be those most willing to discover they're wrong. Being wrong is information. It tells you where your understanding was incomplete, where your reasoning was flawed. Consider two physics students who both get a problem wrong. Student A thinks, "I'm bad at physics." They avoid the problem. Student B thinks, "My model was incomplete. Let me figure out where my reasoning broke down." By semester's end, Student B understands physics far better, not from greater talent, but from treating error as opportunity. The difference is psychological, not intellectual. Student A has fused identity with performance. Being wrong at physics means being a person who is bad at physics. Student B has kept distance between identity and current understanding. Being wrong means the model needs revision. That small difference between "I am bad at this" and "my model needs updating" produces enormous differences in learning over time. The power of different perspectives. No matter how intelligent you are, your perspective is limited by your experience, culture, training, and position. Someone with different experience will notice things you miss. I worked with a nonprofit struggling to reach its target community. The leadership team, well-educated, well-intentioned, couldn't understand why their programs weren't gaining traction. After reluctantly agreeing to informal conversations with community members, they discovered that much of their understanding of the community's priorities was wrong. Their expert analysis had addressed problems that ranked low on the community's actual concerns. They weren't incompetent, but their perspective had blind spots invisible from inside their own framework. The hardest part wasn't accepting the feedback. It was accepting that years of professional training and careful analysis had produced a confident understanding that was fundamentally wrong. Expertise had given them knowledge. It had also given them the confidence to stop looking, and that confidence had become the obstacle. The deeper freedom. Rachel told me later that learning to say, "I hadn't considered that," changed more than her work life. "I'd been carrying this enormous burden," she said. "The burden of needing to be right, needing to know everything. Once I let that go, I felt lighter, free to actually learn." That's what humility offers. Freedom from the exhausting requirement of being right about everything. The world is complex. Understanding is never fully complete. Pretending otherwise makes you rigid, not stronger. But humility has a cost. When you stop performing certainty and start acknowledging what you don't know, you will sometimes be perceived as less competent. Colleagues may mistake your honesty for weakness. You may find yourself in conversations where the most confident voice wins, regardless of accuracy. Humility does not always produce immediate social rewards. What it produces is a more accurate map of reality. And over time, a more accurate map is worth more than a confident wrong one, even if the wrong one gets more applause. Humility is a stance, a way of holding what you know. But what happens when you look clearly at your beliefs and recognize that some of them need to go? That's a different challenge, one that involves not just openness, but active loss. Humility lets you see that a belief might be wrong, or might simply have outlived its usefulness. Unlearning requires you to actually let it go. Chapter 3. The Power of Unlearning. Dr. Patricia Chen had been practicing medicine for 23 years when a younger colleague challenged one of her standard treatment protocols, showing her several peer-reviewed studies suggesting a different approach. Patricia's first reaction was dismissive. She'd been doing this successfully for years. The dismissal wasn't reasoned. It was visceral, immediate, like swatting away something that didn't belong. But something made her pause. She read the studies. The evidence was compelling. Her standard approach, while not harmful, was less effective than the newer method. She changed her protocol. Several months later, she told me, "It was humbling, but my patients are getting better outcomes now. That's what matters." What Patricia didn't mention until much later was what the days immediately after that change felt like. She described a disorientation, walking into the exam room and reaching for the old protocol out of habit, then catching herself. A sense of being a beginner again after 23 years. An irrational flash of resentment toward the younger colleague who had been right. She knew the change was correct. Her body hadn't caught up with her mind. Unlearning, actually letting go of beliefs and methods you've relied on, is harder than learning something new. Learning adds to your knowledge. Unlearning acknowledges that something you believed was incomplete, miscalibrated, or no longer suited to the context you are in. You're not building on your foundation, you're tearing part of it down. Humility is the willingness to see that you might be wrong. Unlearning is what happens when you discover that you are, or that a belief which once fit no longer does. Why unlearning is harder than learning. When you learn something new, you're strengthening connections in the brain. When you unlearn, you're working against patterns reinforced over time, not erasing them so much as building competing ones. The longer you've held a belief, the more resistant it tends to become to revision. But the difficulty goes beyond neuroscience. Unlearning is psychologically threatening in ways that learning is not. You're admitting that something you relied on, something that may have served you well, no longer holds. You're acknowledging that actions taken on that belief might have been misguided. The ego resists, usually through rationalization. That belief was correct in context, or the new information doesn't really contradict what I thought. And there is sunk cost. If you've built a career on a particular approach, changing it means confronting the possibility that years of work rested on a flawed premise. If you've raised children according to a philosophy you now question, you face not just an intellectual revision but a moral one. Did I do something wrong with the people who matter most to me? The stakes of unlearning are tangled with regret, responsibility, and consequences that cannot be undone. This is where many people stop. Not because they can't see the evidence, not because they lack intelligence, but because the emotional cost of proceeding feels, in that moment, greater than the cost of staying wrong. and in that moment it might be. The cost of staying with a belief that no longer fits is distributed across the future, diffuse, invisible, easy to ignore. The cost of letting it go is concentrated in the present, sharp, immediate, felt in the chest. How old beliefs limit you. James, a middle manager at a manufacturing company, believed employees needed close supervision to stay productive. When promoted to oversee software developers and designers, his approach backfired. Creative professionals rarely thrive under constant monitoring. Because the belief had served him well for years, he couldn't question it. He blamed his team. Outdated beliefs operate this way. They worked in one context, so you apply them everywhere, like a coat that no longer fits, constricting but familiar enough that taking it off feels like losing part of yourself. James's belief wasn't merely a theory, it was validated by years of results. He had evidence. That authority made it almost impossible to question even when circumstances had clearly changed. The cruelest feature of outdated beliefs. The ones that trap you most effectively are the ones that used to be right. When James finally began to see what was happening, months later, after losing 2 of his best developers, he described the experience not as a realization, but as a slow nausea. The evidence had been accumulating for weeks. He had been explaining it away. The moment he stopped explaining was not triumphant. It was quiet and slightly sickening, the recognition that he had been the problem, and that the people who had left had been right to leave. Beliefs and identity. You don't just hold beliefs, you identify with them. I'm someone who values hard work. I'm someone who doesn't trust easily. These aren't just ideas, they're definitions of who you are. When a belief becomes part of your identity, questioning it feels like questioning yourself. A client named David held a firm belief that expressing emotion was weakness. It was destroying his marriage. Intellectually, he could see the problem. Emotionally, he couldn't let go. If I'm not the strong one, he asked, then who am I? That question captures unlearning's core challenge. David had to see that he was not his beliefs. He was a person who held them and could change them without ceasing to exist. His strength came from qualities like reliability and integrity that would remain regardless of how he handled feelings. But this distinction is easier to state than to live. The fusion between belief and identity happens gradually, without conscious awareness. By the time you try to separate them, the belief doesn't feel like something you have. It feels like something you are. Unlearning requires trust that you will still be you on the other side. That trust comes not from argument but from experience, from having survived a previous revision and found yourself still intact. The first time is the hardest. David's first attempt at vulnerability with his wife, telling her plainly that he was afraid of losing her, left him feeling exposed for days. He described it as walking around without skin. Nothing terrible happened. She didn't mock him, she cried, and then she held him, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. But the exposure didn't feel safe. It felt like a risk that happened to turn out well. It was only after the second time, and the third, that the new way of being began to feel less like a performance, and more like something that was actually his. The emotional dimension. Beliefs carry emotional weight. Everything happens for a reason, makes suffering feel meaningful rather than random. People can't be trusted prevents betrayal but enforces isolation. This is why evidence alone seldom changes minds. A belief may be factually wrong and still be doing real psychological work, protecting someone from vulnerability, giving meaning to pain. Until that emotional function is addressed, the belief will resist revision no matter how much evidence is marshaled against it. Unlearning requires feeling through the discomfort of letting go, not just analyzing it. You must tolerate the temporary groundlessness, the period after releasing an old belief and before a new understanding has fully formed. That in-between space is where most people turn back. It has no name and no map. You have given up the old way of seeing and have not yet arrived at a new one. You are, for a time, without a story about who you are and how the world works. The temptation to grab back the old belief, even knowing it no longer serves you, is enormous, because a familiar belief still feels like solid ground compared to no belief at all. Practical approaches. Regularly audit your beliefs. For each, ask, where did this come from? What evidence supports it? What contradicts it? Does it still serve me? Is the context in which it formed still the context I'm operating in? Hold beliefs as hypotheses rather than conclusions. You're not admitting you were wrong. You're updating based on new data. A hypothesis that doesn't survive contact with evidence is doing exactly what hypotheses are supposed to do. The liberation of letting go. 6 months after changing her protocol, Patricia told me, "I feel lighter. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending defending my old approach. Every time I read about new treatment methods, part of my brain was working to dismiss them. Letting go feels like loss, but results in freedom. Holding tightly to outdated beliefs costs constant energy." Patricia was lighter because she'd stopped fighting. A part of her mind permanently occupied with defense was now available for curiosity, learning, and engagement with what was actually true. She told me something else that stayed with me. She said that for the first few weeks after the change, she had dreams about her old protocol. Dreams where she was performing it perfectly, with confidence, the way she had for years. She would wake up and feel a pang of something like homesickness. Not for the protocol itself, for the certainty, for the feeling of knowing exactly what to do without having to think about it. That feeling was gone now, replaced by something more alert and less comfortable. She was a better doctor. She also missed, in some small way, the doctor she had been. Unlearning clears ground, but clearing ground is not growing something new. You can release old beliefs, create space, develop humility, and still stand in the cleared space uncertain what comes next. What pulls you forward, toward new understanding rather than just away from old beliefs, is curiosity. Chapter 4. Curiosity and Intellectual Exploration. When Elena was 7 years old, she asked her father why the sky was blue. He explained about light scattering. She asked why light scatters. He explained wavelengths. She asked what wavelengths were. Her father, exhausted, finally said, "Elena, you ask too many questions." After that, Elena rarely asked her father why without bracing for annoyance. By the time I met Elena, she was 34, working in accounting, describing her life as in a rut. Somewhere between 7 and 34, she'd absorbed the lesson that curiosity was annoying, that adults were supposed to already know things rather than wonder about them. The previous chapters addressed what to do with beliefs you already hold. Examine them, loosen them, let the outdated or ill-fitting ones go. Curiosity is a fundamentally different capacity. Humility and unlearning are subtractive. They remove false certainty, release outdated beliefs, create space. Curiosity is additive. It's the forward-pulling force, the drive toward what you don't yet know. Without it, the work of the previous chapters produces only emptiness, beliefs examined and discarded, but nothing emerging to take their place. What intellectual curiosity actually is. Intellectual curiosity is the sustained desire to understand, to know not just what happened, but why it happened, how it works, and what else it connects to. It's driven by intrinsic motivation. It tolerates, even enjoys, uncertainty. It's self-sustaining. The more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. Intellectual curiosity is independent of immediate utility. You don't need a practical reason to be curious. The curiosity itself is the reason. One of the surest ways adults kill their own curiosity is by demanding that every inquiry justify itself in advance. Why would I need to know that? Is the question that shuts curiosity down. Why adults lose curiosity. From a young age, we receive messages that curiosity is problematic. Over time, we learn it's socially costly. Adult life rewards having answers, not having questions. Time scarcity plays a role. Many adults have internalized the idea that learning should be practical, or concluded they're simply not intellectual, creating self-fulfilling limitations. But the deepest reason is that curiosity requires willingness to be a beginner, and being a beginner is, for most adults, almost unbearable. You have spent decades building competence, developing expertise that earns respect and income. Curiosity about a new domain puts you back at zero. You misunderstand things specialists find obvious. For someone whose identity is built on competence, this is not merely inconvenient, it is threatening. The death of adult curiosity is often, at least in part, a defense against the vulnerability of not knowing. The 7-year-old who asked why the sky was blue had something the 34-year-old had lost. Not just a habit of questioning, but an unself-conscious relationship with not knowing. Children are curious without thinking of themselves as curious. They don't have to overcome the feeling that questions reveal inadequacy. Adults who try to reclaim curiosity are working against decades of conditioning that equates ignorance with failure. They are not returning to a childlike state. They are building something new, an adult curiosity that includes self-awareness and the willingness to be a beginner that the culture spent years training out of them. Harder than childhood curiosity. Also more valuable because it is chosen. Curiosity as a developable skill. Curiosity is a skill, not a fixed trait. Just as anyone can become more physically fit through exercise, anyone can become more intellectually curious through practice. A client named Robert, at 56, felt intellectually dormant. We started small. I asked him to identify one thing he was even mildly curious about. He mentioned he'd always wondered how bridges stayed up. He investigated. That led to questions about different designs, then physics, then materials science. 6 months later, he developed a habit of noticing when he wondered about something and actually following it. What Robert didn't mention at first, what most people don't mention, was the part before curiosity felt rewarding. The evenings spent reading about structural engineering and understanding almost nothing. Rereading the same paragraph 4 times and still not being sure he'd grasped it. The particular embarrassment of searching for terms that a first-year student would already know. He told me later that he nearly quit twice in the first month. Not because he lost interest, but because feeling slow and confused at 56 felt like confirmation of something he'd feared about himself. The excitement came later. The beginning was just awkwardness, endured. What surprised Robert was that curiosity, once reactivated, required less effort over time rather than more. The initial resistance, why bother, I don't have time, faded as the rewards of following a question became tangible. Each answer opens new questions. Each new field reveals connections to what you already know. The mental landscape, once flat and predictable, develops contour and depth. Building the habit. Start with specific commitments, not vague aspirations. I want to be more curious generates no action. I'm going to spend 30 minutes this Saturday reading about how bridges are designed is a practice. The difference between people who rebuild curiosity and people who wish they were more curious is almost always the difference between specific commitments and general desires. Step outside your comfort zone. When you engage with a completely new field, you feel incompetent. The compounding effect. When Elena began rebuilding her curiosity, starting with simple questions about things she encountered daily, something unexpected happened. The more she investigated, the more questions emerged. She started by wondering why certain plants grew well in her garden. That led to soil composition, then chemistry, then photosynthesis, then physics. A year in, she told me, I feel like my brain woke up. I'm interested in things again. Unlike many cognitive skills that require sustained willpower, curiosity generates its own fuel. The initial effort is real. You have to push past the inertia of, that's interesting, but never mind. But once moving, the process becomes self-sustaining. Each discovery generates more questions. Each question generates more engagement. The person who felt intellectually dormant 6 months ago now finds themselves unable to walk past a bookstore without going in. Curiosity in isolation has limits, however. The growth it enables flourishes best when supported by the right environment. And one of the most powerful environmental catalysts for growth is feedback from other people. Chapter 5. Building a Culture of Feedback. Marcus had been managing his team for 3 years when he finally received honest feedback about his leadership style. A departing employee, during her exit interview, told him that his constant corrections made people feel incompetent. Team members had largely stopped sharing ideas, in part because they expected to be told why those ideas wouldn't work. Marcus was stunned. He thought of himself as thorough and helpful. He had always believed that pointing out flaws early saved everyone time, that his team would thank him for catching problems before they grew. He had built his identity around being the person who saw what others missed. The exit interview upended that story. He wasn't the helpful one. He was the reason people had stopped trying. This is the problem with blind spots. You can't see them. You need other people to show you what you're missing. And others will only do that if you've created conditions where honesty is possible. Marcus had not created those conditions. He had created the opposite. an environment where honesty was punished with correction, where every idea offered became an invitation for critique. The feedback culture he thought he was building was actually a silence culture, and he had been the last to know. Everything discussed so far, intellectual development, humility, unlearning, curiosity, is internal. Feedback is where the internal work meets the external world. It is a mirror that shows you what self-reflection alone cannot. Without it, your self-knowledge is limited to what you can see from inside your own perspective. And as the previous chapters have made clear, that perspective is systematically incomplete. You can be humble in principle and still miss the specific ways your behavior affects others. You can be curious in general and still never think to ask the questions that would reveal your blind spots. Feedback closes the loop. It tells you not just what you intended, but what you produced. Why feedback matters. Feedback reveals what you cannot see alone. It builds trust. Relationships where people give honest feedback tend to be stronger than those built on politeness. And teams that welcome feedback tend to adapt faster than those that don't. Feedback is not primarily about correction. It is about calibration. Without it, you don't just miss your mistakes, you miss the full picture of your impact. You may not know that a strength you take for granted is actually distinctive and valuable. You may not realize that a habit you consider minor is, to others, defining. Feedback is one of the primary mechanisms by which your self-image comes into alignment with reality. There's also a temporal dimension. The sooner feedback arrives, the easier it is to use. A small course correction early is far less costly than a major revision later. But most feedback systems, formal reviews, exit interviews, relationship ruptures, deliver information long after the behavior has become entrenched. By the time Marcus heard the truth, his team had already adapted around him. They had learned to stay quiet. The feedback came too late to prevent the damage. It could only inform the repair. This is why actively seeking feedback matters more than passively receiving it. If you wait for feedback to arrive on its own, it will arrive late, if it arrives at all. The people around you are constantly forming impressions, but they are rarely volunteering them. You have to go looking. The usual reactions. Despite its value, feedback often triggers reactions that prevent us from using it. Anger makes us defensive. Shame collapses us inward. Dismissal finds reasons the feedback doesn't apply. Rationalization reframes the feedback as the other person's problem, their misunderstanding, their sensitivity, their agenda. These reactions share something. They treat feedback as a verdict rather than as data. The shift from verdict to data, treating feedback as information about how your actions land, not as a judgment of your worth, is what makes feedback usable. But making that shift in the moment is harder than it sounds. Feedback, especially unexpected feedback, arrives as a felt experience before it arrives as information. Your body reacts before your mind can evaluate. The flush of shame, the spike of anger, the impulse to justify. These are not rational responses, and they cannot be managed through rational argument alone. They must be tolerated. You must feel the reaction and choose not to act on it. This takes practice. It is, in many ways, a physical skill as much as an intellectual one. The goal is not to stop having the reaction. That may not be possible. The goal is to create a gap between the reaction and your response. to feel the flush and not speak from it, to notice the defensiveness rising and let it rise without letting it dictate what you say next. In that gap, you can ask a question instead of mounting a defense. You can say, "Tell me more," instead of, "But that's not what I meant." The first few times you do this, it will feel unnatural, like holding your breath underwater. Over time, the gap widens. The reaction still comes, but it no longer controls what follows. Creating a feedback culture. At work, actively seek input rather than waiting for formal reviews. Ask specific questions. What's one thing I could do differently in these meetings? Vague questions get vague answers. Do you have any feedback for me? Invites, "No, you're doing fine." Specificity signals that you actually want to know. In relationships, create space for honest discussion. When you interrupted me in front of your parents, I felt dismissed is feedback. You always interrupt me is accusation. The difference matters. Feedback describes impact without assigning motive. Accusation assumes intent and invites defense. If you want honest feedback from the people closest to you, you have to make it safe for them to give it. And that means receiving it without retaliation, even when it stings. Toward personal goals, seek input from people who will point out weaknesses, not just friends who will encourage. Encouragement feels good, but teaches little. The friend who says, "That was great," after every attempt is not helping you improve. The friend who says, "The opening was strong, but you lost me in the middle," is giving you something you can use. Feedback doesn't arrive naturally. You have to create conditions for it. Ask explicitly, receive it visibly well, make it safe for others to be honest. Few people will volunteer honest feedback unless they have strong evidence that you actually want it, and that giving it will not damage the relationship. Creating that evidence is an ongoing project, not a one-time declaration. You build it through repeated instances of asking, receiving non-defensively, and visibly using what you heard. Each cycle makes the next one easier. Each defensive reaction sets the project back. There is also a structural dimension. Some environments make feedback almost impossible. If your position carries power over the person you're asking, their honesty is constrained by their vulnerability. A boss who asks a direct report for feedback is asking someone whose livelihood depends on the boss's goodwill. The request may be genuine, but the asymmetry is real. In such cases, anonymous mechanisms, third-party facilitators, or explicit protections may be necessary to get information that would otherwise never surface. Growth mindset as foundation. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research distinguishes two orientations toward ability. A fixed mindset treats talents as largely innate. You either have them or you don't. A growth mindset treats them as developable through effort and experience. The same feedback, "Your presentation was disorganized," lands differently depending on mindset. Fixed, "I'm bad at presentations, I should avoid them." Growth, "I need to work on structure, I'll prepare differently next time." The fixed mindset hears a verdict. The growth mindset hears a direction. Notice fixed mindset patterns, avoiding challenges, giving up quickly, taking feedback personally, without judgment, then shift. A child learning to walk falls constantly, and no one interprets those falls as evidence that the child cannot walk. The same principle applies at any age, but adults have a harder time remembering it because the expectation of competence is so deeply embedded that every stumble feels like proof of limitation rather than evidence of learning in progress. The connection to feedback is direct. If you believe your abilities are fixed, feedback threatens your self-concept. Every critique implies a ceiling. But if you believe your abilities are developable, feedback becomes information about where to focus next. The threat dissolves. What remains is direction. The central paradox of the feedback: you need it most precisely when you are least able to hear it. When your blind spot is largest, you are also most defended against the information that would correct it. The person who most needs to hear that they are alienating their team is often the one who will react most defensively to that information. This cannot be solved in advance. It can only be navigated in real time by building enough trust that when the critical feedback arrives, you have a channel through which it can reach you, even if your first reaction is to close that channel. Putting it together. Marcus took his exit interview feedback seriously. He started asking his team for input and responding non-defensively. He caught himself before reflexive corrections. When someone offered an idea, he practiced saying, "Tell me more," before saying anything evaluative. It felt awkward at first, performative even, but he kept doing it. Over time, the team culture shifted. People started sharing ideas again. Meetings that had once been monologues became conversations. Marcus developed a skill he hadn't had before: the ability to develop others rather than just correct them. He learned that his job was not to have the right answer, but to create conditions where the right answer could emerge from anyone. What Marcus discovered was that the feedback was less important than what it revealed about his assumptions. He had assumed his corrections were helpful. He had assumed his team's silence was agreement. He had assumed competence meant having the right answer, rather than creating conditions for the right answer to emerge. Each assumption was invisible until feedback made it visible. The experience didn't just change his management style. It changed his understanding of what management was for. He told me later that the hardest part wasn't hearing the initial feedback. It was the weeks afterward, when he kept noticing himself doing the thing he'd been told he did. The pattern was so ingrained that awareness alone didn't stop it. He would catch himself mid-correction, already 3 sentences into explaining why an idea wouldn't work. The gap between knowing and doing was humbling. It took months before the new behavior felt natural, before "tell me more" was a reflex rather than a discipline. Feedback and growth mindset can change your relationship to criticism. But there's a subtler problem they don't address: the systematic errors in reasoning that operate beneath awareness. You can be humble, open to feedback, and willing to learn, and still be systematically wrong, because the distortion is not in your attitude, but in the cognitive machinery itself. Biases don't ask your permission. They can distort perception before feedback even reaches you. By the way, if you've listened up to this point, write the word "listening" in the comments. It's interesting to see how many of us are here. Chapter 6: Overcoming Bias. In the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, many prominent economists and institutions expressed confidence the system was stable. When the collapse came, it came fast. These were experts with sophisticated models and decades of experience. Yet, in the aggregate, their confidence was badly miscalibrated relative to the actual risk. They didn't know what they didn't know. and their tools for analyzing the economy were built on the same assumptions they were trying to test. The flaw was not only in the analysis, but in the analysts themselves. Intellectual humility, discussed in Chapter 2, is a stance you can choose. You can decide to hold your beliefs more lightly, to acknowledge uncertainty, to say, "I don't know." Bias is something else entirely. Biases are systematic distortions built into cognition itself, errors that produce false certainty without your awareness or consent. You don't decide to be overconfident. Your brain generates the feeling of understanding whether or not you actually understand. The distinction matters because it changes what the work looks like. Humility is a posture you adopt. Bias is a condition you manage. Humility requires willingness, the decision to remain open. Overcoming bias requires vigilance, the ongoing effort to detect and correct errors your mind produces automatically, reliably, and invisibly. You cannot simply choose to be less biased the way you can choose to be more humble, though humility helps, because it keeps you looking for distortions you might otherwise ignore. The distortion itself operates upstream of choice. The illusion of knowledge. Try explaining in detail how a zipper works, not just the teeth interlock, but the actual mechanism. Most people discover they can't. They had a feeling of understanding without the actual understanding. This illusion extends to consequential domains, how the economy works, why relationships collapse, what causes projects to fail. Genuine ignorance prompts investigation. The illusion of knowledge prevents it. And this is what makes it dangerous. Not the gap itself, but the fact that the gap is sealed over. Unlike genuine ignorance, which at least announces itself as a question, the illusion feels like an answer. You walk around confident that you understand how zippers work. The gap never surfaces, because the feeling of understanding fills the space the gap would otherwise occupy. There's nothing missing, as far as you can tell. That is precisely the problem. This is what makes bias harder to address than any other challenge in this book. Stagnation feels like stability, but with effort, you can detect it. Humility is hard, but you can choose it. Outdated beliefs resist release, but you can identify them. Bias operates below the level of choice. It is a distortion in the instrument you are using to detect distortions. You cannot will away a flaw in your thinking from the inside alone. You can only reduce its impact through habits and structures, external checks, other perspectives, systematic doubt, that compensate for what you cannot see directly. The earlier chapters gave you the willingness. This chapter is about building the architecture. How overconfidence hurts. When you believe you know more than you do, you stop gathering information too early. You dismiss contradicting evidence. You mistake the feeling of knowing for the fact of knowing. A client, David, was certain his wife, Sarah, wanted more quality time. He kept planning activities. She kept seeming unsatisfied. When we finally got past his certainty, Sarah revealed she wanted something different entirely. For him to be present during ordinary moments, to put down his phone, to actually listen. His confidence had kept him from discovering what she actually needed. David was not indifferent. He was attentive, thoughtful, invested. But his confidence in his understanding meant all that attentiveness was aimed at the wrong target. The effort was real. The care was genuine. None of it landed because the premise was wrong. Overconfidence doesn't just produce wrong answers. It produces wrong answers accompanied by the conviction that you're doing everything right, so you keep doing the wrong thing with increasing frustration, never questioning the assumption underneath. When David finally understood what Sarah had been asking for, he didn't feel relieved. He felt disoriented. Months of planned dates, thoughtful gestures, genuine effort, all built on a misreading he had never thought to question. The ground shifted beneath him. Not just on this one issue, but on his trust in his own perception. If he had been this confidently wrong about something this close to him, about a person he loved, in a relationship he was paying attention to, then the error wasn't circumstantial. It was structural. Something in how he formed conclusions was unreliable, and he hadn't known. That disorientation is what distinguishes discovering a bias from discovering a wrong belief. A wrong belief is a single error. You learn the correct information, update, and move on. A bias is a pattern of errors, a systematic tendency to err in a particular direction, one you did not choose and cannot simply decide to stop. When you discover consistent overconfidence, the realization extends backward through time. It is not that you were wrong once. It is that you have likely been wrong in this way, in this direction, across hundreds of judgments you don't even remember making. The revision required is not one belief, but an entire pattern of cognition, a recalibration of your relationship to your own certainty. That is harder to sit with than a single mistake, and it explains why many people, upon learning about cognitive biases in the abstract, nod in agreement but change nothing. Acknowledging that biases exist in general is easy. Acknowledging that they are operating in you right now, shaping judgments you cannot directly perceive, that is a different order of acknowledgement. Calibrating confidence. The best available corrective for bias is not self-doubt, but calibration, matching your confidence to the actual state of your knowledge. Certain when you have good grounds. Uncertain when the situation is genuinely unclear. Honest about which is which. Where humility is a stance you cultivate, calibration is a skill you practice. Learning to notice the gap between how sure you feel and how much you actually know. The two are related but distinct. You can be humble in general while still falling prey to the illusion of knowledge on a specific topic. Calibration is humility made precise, applied not as a general attitude, but at the level of individual claims, individual judgments, individual moments of certainty. The bias itself arises automatically. What you control is the procedural habit of checking for it. Before acting on a belief, pause to ask what you're basing it on. Am I acting on evidence or on the feeling of evidence? Have I actually verified this, or does it just feel verified? The gap between I know this and I feel like I know this is where bias lives. Closing that gap is not a one-time achievement. Your brain will keep generating the feeling of knowledge whether or not actual knowledge is present. The feeling is not under your control. The habit of checking is. Recognizing the limits of knowledge is essential, but knowing you might be wrong doesn't automatically make you able to think differently in the moment. For that, you need a different capacity, not a stance or a correction, but the real-time ability to shift your thinking when circumstances demand it. Chapter 7. Cognitive Flexibility. When the pandemic hit in 2020, restaurants faced an existential threat. Dining rooms closed within days. Revenue disappeared. Some adapted remarkably fast. They pivoted to takeout, redesigned menus for travel, set up outdoor dining in parking lots, created meal kits, launched virtual cooking classes. One owner described the shift. We had to stop thinking of ourselves as a place where people come to eat and start thinking of ourselves as a way to bring good food into people's lives. Once we made that mental shift, we could see options we couldn't see before. That mental shift is the subject of this chapter. The earlier chapters address how you relate to your beliefs, with humility, willingness to unlearn, curiosity, calibrated confidence. These are primarily reflective capacities. You step back, examine your thinking, adjust. Cognitive flexibility is different. It is the capacity to reframe in real time, to shift your thinking in the moment, under pressure, when your current approach stops working and you don't have the luxury of reflection. Humility is what you bring to a conversation. Flexibility is what you do in the middle of one, when everything you plan to say turns out to be wrong. What cognitive flexibility is. Cognitive flexibility means switching between different framings of a situation, updating your approach when it stops working, holding multiple possibilities simultaneously, and finding alternatives when your first approach is blocked. This is compatible with having core values. The rigid thinker sticks to a failing strategy, calling it staying true to principles. The flexible thinker finds new ways to serve those principles when old ways stop working. Flexibility is not the absence of conviction. It is the ability to pursue your convictions through more than one pathway. The distinction between what should not change, your values, your commitments, your sense of what matters, and what should adapt, your methods, your framings, your strategies, is one of the most important discriminations a clear thinker can make. A tree in a storm bends rather than breaks, and it bends because it is firmly rooted. Flexibility without roots is directionless. Rigidity without flexibility is brittle. It holds until it can't, then shatters. Flexible versus rigid thinking. Rigid thinking locks into a single perspective. Contradicting information bounces off. It applies the same approach regardless of context and resolves ambiguity prematurely, jumping to conclusions to escape discomfort. Flexible thinking shifts between perspectives deliberately. It adapts strategy to context, sees change as containing both challenge and possibility, and tolerates ambiguity while gathering more information. The difference is not always visible from the outside. A rigid thinker and a flexible thinker may hold the same position on a given issue. The difference emerges when conditions change. The rigid thinker holds the position because it is the position they hold, because changing would mean admitting error, because the position has fused with identity. The flexible thinker holds it because the evidence supports it. And if the evidence shifts, the position shifts with it. Same view. Entirely different relationship to that view. Rigidity has a particular feel from the inside, though it rarely identifies itself as rigidity. It feels like clarity, like resolve, like knowing what you think and refusing to be swayed by every passing argument. The rigid thinker experiences their rigidity as strength, and this is what makes it so resistant to change. You cannot fix what feels like a virtue. Developing flexibility. Start with small changes to routine. Low-stakes departures that exercise the same mental capacity, higher stakes adaptation requires. Take a different route to work. Read a publication from a political perspective you don't share. Order something unfamiliar. These are trivial in isolation, but they practice the underlying skill, tolerating departure from the expected. Notice your resistance. That discomfort is rigidity being challenged. Even at this small scale, the resistance is real. You will feel a pullback toward the familiar, a quiet insistence that the old route was better, the usual order was fine, the exercise is pointless. That pull is worth paying attention to, because it is the same pull that operates at much higher stakes. The pull to maintain your current strategy in a failing project, to hold your current position in a shifting argument, to keep doing what you've always done, because changing feels like losing something. The low-stakes practice matters not because taking a different route to work is important, but because it lets you feel that pull without consequence, and practice overriding it. Practice perspective-taking. When you encounter someone who sees a situation differently, ask, how does this look from their position? The goal is to articulate someone else's view well enough that they would say, yes, that's what I think, even if you ultimately disagree. Comprehension of a view you disagree with is one of the most demanding intellectual exercises there is, far harder than comprehending a view you already share. Ask, what else could be true? A colleague doesn't respond to your email. Your automatic interpretation is they're ignoring you. But what else could be true? They might be overwhelmed, might have missed it, might be thinking carefully. Generating alternatives loosens the grip of your first interpretation. Your first interpretation doesn't arrive as one option among many. It arrives as the truth, as what is obviously happening. Generating alternatives therefore feels artificial, like deliberately considering things you know aren't true. The emotional experience of what else could be true is often not curiosity but annoyance, the feeling of being asked to entertain something you've already resolved. That feeling of resolution is precisely the problem. It is premature closure disguised as clarity. If you push through and genuinely consider alternatives, you will sometimes discover your automatic interpretation was right. Other times, you will discover it was wrong in ways you could not have detected without the exercise. The only way to know which case you're in is to do the exercise, especially when it feels unnecessary. The benefits. As flexibility develops, stress often decreases. Much of stress comes from the gap between how we think things should be and how they are. Flexibility narrows that gap, not by changing reality, but by making your expectations more responsive to it. Creativity tends to increase. Learning accelerates. Decision quality improves. The restaurant owners who adapted didn't have special knowledge about what would work. They had the flexibility to try things, see what worked, adjust, and try again. They let go of how things used to be and engaged with how things actually were. The flexible mind is simply a more interesting place to live. When you can shift between perspectives, when ambiguity feels like an invitation rather than a threat, the world becomes richer. The experience of thinking itself changes, from something that confirms what you already know to something that genuinely surprises you. Flexibility helps you adapt and find new approaches. But what happens when those approaches also fail? Every capacity discussed so far, humility, unlearning, curiosity, feedback, bias correction, flexibility, assumes you have the emotional bandwidth to apply it. Failure is where that assumption gets tested. Chapter 8. Failure as an Opportunity for Growth. A client of mine once described the moment she learned her project had been canceled. She had spent 4 months leading a team redesign, late nights, weekend work, difficult conversations with resistant colleagues. The email from her director was 2 sentences. The initiative no longer aligned with strategic priorities. Her work was thanked in the past tense. She told me she read the email 3 times, closed her laptop, and sat in her car for 20 minutes. She wasn't thinking about lessons or growth. She was thinking about the meeting where she had assured her team this would work. She was thinking about her director's face. She was thinking about whether people had known before she did. That is what failure actually feels like before it becomes anything useful. The chapters on humility, unlearning, and flexibility all require willingness to be wrong. But willingness to be wrong in the abstract, as a principle you endorse, is different from being wrong in practice, with real consequences, in front of people whose opinion matters to you. Failure is where the principles of this book get tested under emotional pressure. It is one thing to say you are open to error. It is another to feel the sting of an actual error and continue to lean into it rather than recoil from it. Why failure feels so threatening. Research suggests that social rejection and negative evaluation, both central to public failure, activate overlapping neural systems involved in pain processing. Failure threatens our sense of competence, especially in cultures that celebrate success and hide struggle. These responses made evolutionary sense. But in modern life, most failures carry no survival stakes. A rejected application is not exile from society. Yet our emotional responses often don't distinguish between catastrophic and manageable failure. Understanding this disproportionality is the first step toward using failure productively. There is also the difference between private and public failure. A mistake made alone carries relatively little emotional weight. The same mistake made in front of colleagues carries enormously more. The cognitive error is identical. The emotional experience is categorically different. Failure's sting comes largely from its social dimension, from what we believe it signals to others about our competence. Reducing that sting often involves, at some level, loosening your dependence on others' estimation of you as a source of self-worth, which is one of the hardest psychological tasks there is. The immediate aftermath of failure is where the difficulty is most acute. A purely reactive period precedes any analysis or reframing. The chest tightens. The mind generates explanations, not to understand, but to defend. You rehearse what you will say when someone asks what happened. You imagine how others are interpreting it. You want to withdraw, or to explain at length, or both simultaneously. In that window, the idea of treating failure as information is not just difficult, it is absurd. It is a thing you might believe in theory and cannot access in practice. The gap between those two states, between endorsing a principle and living inside the moment where it applies, is the actual subject of this chapter. Growth requires leaving the comfort zone. Growth happens at the edges, where failure is possible. People who avoid failure tend to stagnate. People willing to fail keep learning. This creates an uncomfortable tension. The thing you most need to do is the thing you are most likely to get wrong. The conversations that would teach you the most are those where you're most likely to say something wrong. The projects that would stretch you most are those most likely to fail. Competence is built from a history of incompetence. If, and only if, you engage with the incompetence rather than flee from it. Understanding yourself through failure. Failure reveals things success obscures. When things go well, it's hard to know why. Was it strategy, effort, or luck? Failure is more informative. A client named Nathan had started 3 failed businesses. Initially, he focused on external factors, bad timing, difficult partners. But examined carefully, patterns emerged. In each case, among other factors, he'd avoided difficult conversations until problems became crises. He'd ignored early warning signs. These patterns would have continued sabotaging him if failure hadn't made them visible. 3 failed businesses could just as easily have produced bitterness or self-pity. The same data can be processed defensively or analytically. Failure becomes information only when you choose to treat it as information. That choice requires precisely the humility, honesty, and willingness to be wrong that the earlier chapters describe. Failure is not a separate topic. It is the crucible in which everything else in this book gets tested. Building resilience and creativity. Each time you encounter failure and continue, you build evidence that failure is survivable. Many people's relationship with failure is defensive, organized around minimizing the chance it will happen. They choose paths where success is likely, avoid situations where failure is possible, and frame their lives to reduce exposure to judgment. This works in the narrow sense that it reduces failure's frequency, but it has a devastating side effect. It also reduces the frequency of growth, discovery, and meaningful accomplishment. Over time, this defensive posture becomes self-reinforcing. The less you fail, the less practice you have at recovering, which makes each failure feel more threatening, which increases the motivation to avoid it. Failure avoidance tends to make you more fragile over time, not less. Building a different relationship, one organized around engagement rather than avoidance, does not eliminate the sting. It changes what happens after. Instead of retreat, investigation. Instead of self-blame, analysis. Instead of the conclusion that you should not have tried, the question of what to try next. This develops cumulatively over many failures, as the evidence that failure is survivable becomes too robust to dismiss. Failure also forces creativity. Many inventions emerged from failed attempts at something else, penicillin from contaminated experiments, Post-it notes from adhesive that wouldn't bond strongly. The key is responding with, "What else could work?" rather than, "Nothing will work." Reframing and moving forward. When failure happens, ask, what specifically didn't work? What was outside my control? What was within it? What would I do differently? Avoid 2 errors. Over-attributing to external factors, the timing was wrong, and over-attributing to personal inadequacy, I'm just not good enough. The most useful analysis identifies specific changeable factors pointing toward specific improvements. Allow yourself to feel disappointment, but set a limit on dwelling. Reconnect with your underlying purpose. Break next steps into small actions. If you build this habit, processing failure systematically rather than collapsing under it or rationalizing it away, failure becomes less threatening because you know you have a way through it. Failure often narrows our focus. We replay what happened, see the situation through a single distressing lens. But this narrowing affects more than how we process setbacks. It shapes how we approach challenges of all kinds, and it becomes most dangerous precisely when the stakes are highest. Chapter 9. Overcoming Tunnel Vision. A surgeon I know described the moment she realized she was about to make a serious mistake. She was deep into a complex procedure, focused intensely on one complication, when a nurse asked a question that seemed irrelevant. She almost dismissed it, but something made her pause, look up, and take in the broader situation. She had missed early signs of a change in the patient's condition that mattered. What struck her afterward was not that she'd almost missed it. It was that, in the moment, her narrowed focus had felt like exactly the right thing to be doing. She wasn't distracted, she wasn't careless. She was intensely, dangerously concentrated. And that concentration had become the problem. This is tunnel vision, the acute narrowing of attention under pressure that causes you to miss what falls outside your immediate focus. Every chapter in this book addresses a way thinking narrows, through unchallenged assumptions, ego, outdated beliefs, lost curiosity, missing feedback, bias, rigidity, fear of failure. These are chronic patterns built over time, operating in the background of ordinary life. Tunnel vision is different. It is what happens in the moment, when stress, stakes, or time pressure collapse your cognitive field to a single point, and everything outside that point disappears. This isn't a distant or gradual change. It's immediate. How tunnel vision works. Our brains prioritize. When something seems important or threatening, attention narrows. Under stress, the stress response tends to constrict both visual and cognitive perception. You become locked onto the perceived threat, losing awareness of context and alternatives. Time pressure compounds the effect. When rushed, you default to your first interpretation without testing it. Emotional intensity narrows focus toward its object and away from everything else. This is not a malfunction. It is the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. Concentrate all available resources on the most immediate threat. When a car swerves into your lane, you don't want your brain leisurely considering multiple perspectives. You want it locked on the problem. The difficulty is that the same mechanism activates in situations that are stressful but not life-threatening. A difficult conversation with your boss, a conflict with your partner, a high-stakes presentation. Your brain can narrow as though you are in physical danger, when in fact you are in a situation that would benefit from exactly the broad, flexible thinking that narrowing prevents. The response that would save your life on a highway is the same response that can destroy a negotiation, a medical decision, or a relationship. Recognizing tunnel vision. Tunnel vision doesn't feel narrow. That is its central deception. It feels focused, clear, like you've cut through the noise and arrived at what matters. The false clarity is what makes it dangerous. You are not aware of what you've stopped seeing, because your attention has contracted around what remains. There is no felt experience of the missing information. There is only the compelling sense that you are seeing the situation accurately. You need indirect indicators. Feeling certain under pressure is one. Certainty in a high-stress moment may be false clarity produced by the absence of alternatives rather than by their evaluation. Others' input seeming irrelevant is another. When everyone else's perspective feels beside the point, your focus may have narrowed past the point of usefulness. inability to generate alternatives. Physical signs of stress, tight jaw, shallow breathing, a sense of urgency that has no clear source. Mindfulness and stress management. Mindfulness, paying attention to present experience without judgment, works against tunnel vision by creating a gap between what happens and how you respond. Pause and notice what you're experiencing. This interrupts automatic narrowing. It does not eliminate the stress. It creates a small space between stimulus and reaction. And in that space, you have the possibility of choosing a response rather than being captured by the first one that arrives. Since stress intensifies tunnel vision, managing stress preserves the cognitive breadth that tunnel vision eliminates. Deep breathing can help engage the parasympathetic nervous system. Physical movement can shift your mental state. And if you don't have to respond immediately, don't. "Let me think about that" is not weakness. It is the deliberate act of widening your cognitive field before committing to a course of action. Seeking multiple perspectives. One of the most reliable counters to tunnel vision is deliberately seeking different viewpoints. Before important decisions, ask, who sees this differently? What might they be seeing that I'm not? You can also seek perspective from yourself at different times. How will I see this in a year? What would I think if I weren't so invested? Time perspective is one of the most powerful tools for breaking tunnel vision, because tunnel vision is almost always a present tense phenomenon. It locks you into the now, into the urgency, the emotion, the immediate stakes. The future self, the self who has distance and context, sees things the present self cannot. Accessing that perspective, even briefly, can break the lock. Slowing down and asking questions. Tunnel vision often combines with urgency, but the perception of urgency is frequently exaggerated. The feeling that you must decide now is itself a product of the narrowing. Ask, does this actually need deciding right now? Even small pauses, 30 seconds of deliberate thought, can shift you from reactive to reflective. Questions are the mechanism of that shift. Questions that challenge assumptions. What am I assuming that might not be true? Questions that expand scope. What else is relevant? Who else is affected? Questions that test framing. How else could this situation be described? The discipline of asking questions under pressure, when every impulse says, "act now," is one of the most valuable intellectual habits you can develop. It is also one of the hardest to maintain, because the narrowing produces its own momentum. Once you are locked on, the pull to act is physiological, not just psychological. Integrating logic and intuition. Clear thinking under pressure uses both logic and intuition. Logic helps examine situations systematically. Intuition helps recognize patterns and sense when something is off, like the surgeon's hesitation. Notice your intuitions. Take them seriously as data. Then examine them. Ask whether the feeling makes sense or is a product of stress and bias. Intuition is not always right, but it is worth consulting, precisely because it draws on pattern recognition that operates faster than conscious analysis. The surgeon's pause at the nurse's question was intuition, a signal that something didn't fit, registered before conscious thought could articulate what was wrong. Had she dismissed it, as the narrowing was urging her to do, the consequences could have been severe. Her training saved her not by giving her the right answer, but by giving her the habit of pausing when something felt wrong. even when she couldn't yet say why. Thinking under uncertainty. Many situations that trigger tunnel vision are genuinely uncertain. The discomfort of uncertainty drives the narrowing. You grasp at certainty because ambiguity feels intolerable. Thinking clearly under uncertainty means tolerating not knowing, holding multiple possibilities open, and making decisions with incomplete information while remaining open to revision. There is a deep irony at the center of this. The situations most requiring clear thinking are the situations that most effectively prevent it. High stakes, time pressure, emotional intensity, genuine uncertainty. Each individually degrades the quality of thinking, and they frequently arrive together. A medical emergency, a collapsing business deal, a relationship crisis. These are the moments when you most need the full range of capacities described in this book: humility, flexibility, curiosity, the ability to hold multiple perspectives. And they are the moments when those capacities are least accessible. The conditions that create the need are the same conditions that narrow the resources available to meet it. This is why every capacity in this book must be practiced when the stakes are low. You cannot develop the ability to think clearly under pressure by waiting until you are under pressure. By then, you have only what you've already built. The practice happens before the crisis. The crisis reveals what the practice has produced. Not what you know about clear thinking, but what you can actually do when the narrowing sets in and every instinct tells you to act on the first thing you see. Conclusion. When I began working with Elena, the woman from Chapter 4 who had stopped asking questions at age 7, she described her thinking as something that happened to her rather than something she did. Thoughts arose, opinions formed, decisions got made. She wasn't absent from the process, but she wasn't steering it. By the time we finished working together, something had shifted. She could notice when she was reacting automatically and choose differently. She could recognize when her certainty exceeded her knowledge. She could hold a question open long enough to discover something she hadn't expected. That shift, from being driven by your thinking to participating in it, is what this book has been about. Awareness before technique. Freedom from limiting beliefs doesn't come from replacing old beliefs with better ones. It comes from seeing how beliefs operate in the first place. Recognizing that your interpretation of a situation is an interpretation, not the situation itself. This makes it possible to update your understanding when evidence warrants. We carry assumptions we've never examined, inherited from family, formed from limited experience, adopted because they were convenient or because everyone around us seemed to share them. These assumptions shape what we notice, how we interpret what happens, and what actions seem possible. As long as they remain invisible, they tend to run us. The moment they become visible, a choice becomes available that wasn't available before. The choice to continue holding the belief, to revise it, or to let it go. This visibility is the foundation of everything else. Every technique in this book, from seeking feedback to practicing flexibility to processing failure, depends on the prior ability to see your own thinking. Without that, you are executing programs. With it, you have the option of revising them. What this book has offered. Each chapter addressed a different dimension of clear thinking, but they share a common structure. Recognize where cognition narrows, then develop practices to widen it. We built the foundations of intellectual development, the basic capacity to think well, which depends on openness, critical thinking, and curiosity. We adopted humility as an epistemic stance, the willingness to calibrate confidence to actual knowledge rather than to the feeling of knowledge. We confronted the identity costs of unlearning, the difficult process of releasing beliefs that once served us but no longer do. We rebuilt curiosity as forward-pulling fuel, the drive that fills the space cleared by unlearning. We created feedback cultures as external mirrors, because self-knowledge formed entirely from the inside is systematically incomplete. We learned to recognize bias as systematic distortion, errors in cognition that operate below the level of choice. We developed cognitive flexibility as real-time reframing, the capacity to shift thinking under pressure. We reframed failure as information available only under emotional load, and we built techniques for overcoming tunnel vision, the acute narrowing that happens when stakes are high and time is short. These are not 9 separate topics. They are 9 facets of a single capacity, the ability to see clearly, especially when something in you would prefer not to. The ongoing practice. Clear thinking is not a state you achieve. It's a practice you return to. Some days you'll do this well. Other days you won't. The goal is direction, not perfection. What changes over time is not the difficulty of the practice, but your relationship to it. At first, noticing your own biases, your own rigidity, your own defensive reactions feels like discovering flaws. Each recognition carries a sting, a sense of, I should have known better. Over time, the same noticing begins to feel like something closer to skill. You catch yourself in tunnel vision, and the experience is not, I'm failing, but there it is, I see it. The observation becomes routine. The self-judgment fades. What remains is a kind of alert attentiveness to your own cognition that feels less like self-criticism and more like maintenance, the ongoing calibration of an instrument you depend on. Progress is often invisible in the moment and obvious only in retrospect. A situation that would have triggered you last year doesn't now. You ask questions you wouldn't have thought to ask. You consider perspectives that previously wouldn't have occurred to you. There's also a social dimension that unfolds over time. As you become more aware of your own cognitive patterns, you become more tolerant of other people's. The colleague who can't admit they're wrong. You recognize the ego trap because you've been in it. The friend who clings to an outdated belief. You recognize the identity fusion because you've experienced it. This is not superiority, it is recognition. And it tends to produce a quality of patience with other people that has nothing to do with being a better person, and everything to do with having a more accurate understanding of how hard this work actually is. What it brings: inner freedom. When you're no longer automatically controlled by every unexamined belief, you have choice. Not the illusion of choice, not the post hoc rationalization of decisions your unconscious already made, but genuine choice, grounded in awareness of what you think and why. Your choices won't always be perfect, but they'll be yours. Accountability. When you've genuinely examined your thinking and made conscious decisions, you can stand behind them, not the heavy, self-blaming kind of accountability, but the mature kind. These are your choices. You made them for reasons you can articulate. You stand behind them, and you remain open to learning when they're wrong. because your identity is not staked on being right. It is staked on being honest. Resilience. The person who can think clearly under pressure, adapt to change, learn from failure, and hold uncertainty without collapsing into false certainty can handle what life brings, not from invulnerability, but from developed capacity. Resilience built on rigid certainty is brittle. It holds until the certainty is contradicted, then shatters. Resilience built on flexible, honest thinking is robust, because it does not depend on any particular belief being true. It depends on the capacity to engage with whatever turns out to be true. Beginning. Start with what resonates. Maybe it's recognizing tunnel vision. Maybe it's seeking feedback more actively. Maybe it's the habit of questioning your first interpretation. Pick one practice and work with it until it becomes more natural. Then add another. The process doesn't end. There's always another assumption to examine, another pattern to notice, another situation that tests your capacity for clear thinking. But this is not a burden, or rather, it stops feeling like one. The process of examining your own thinking, once habitual, is not exhausting. It is enlivening. It is the difference between moving through the world on autopilot and moving through it awake. Elena, near the end of our work together, put it simply. I feel like I woke up. Not that I was asleep before, but that I was dreaming while thinking I was awake. Now, I'm actually here. Actually thinking, actually choosing. That's what's available. The point isn't perfection, it's awareness, and the clarity to deal with whatever shows up. The tools are here. The practice is yours. Thank you for listening until the very end. If you enjoyed this audiobook, support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases.